Hi there, everyone. In this module, we're going to look at the context within which we negotiate. We also call that the negotiation climate. So the environment within which we discuss the subject matter that we're discussing, which is in our case, obviously selling our counterpart on our ideas, on our products, value proposition, and so forth. There's so much focus, the way that the world's built. There's so much focus on the evidence that supports our arguments, on the quantitative elements, that we sometimes forget the importance of the qualitative elements of communication. And I would even go as far as to say that the qualitative elements of communication and negotiation are far more important than the quantitative elements. It's not just what you say, it's not just the subject matter that you cover, but it's how you say it, how you go about covering the subject matter. So I really want to talk about you presenting the content, presenting your arguments in such a way that you significantly enhance the likelihood of getting the yes that you're looking for, of getting the agreement that you're pursuing through your calls. Now, in my many years of experience teaching people and negotiating on behalf of myself and some of my clients, I've really understood that if I wanted to look at a negotiation, or if I'm participating in a negotiation as an observer, which is something that I do or have done in the past when I've acted as a consultant working for some of the biggest organizations in the world, observing the negotiations that they're involved in with a view to, provide them with coaching, feedback, insight, strategizing, finding different ways to approach those negotiations. One of the things that probably has the biggest contribution to my understanding of whether I think a deal is going to happen or not is to observe the climate, the context, the atmosphere within which discussions are taking place. Because here's what I know, if the atmosphere is good, the likelihood of us getting a deal is significantly enhanced. Now, you've all been in a situation probably where the atmosphere or the climate has been terrible and you still managed to get to a deal. And maybe you've been in a situation where the climate has been terrific, it's been amazing, there's been amazing chemistry between you and your counterpart, but you still didn't manage to get a deal. But you'll agree with me that those are the exceptions. The rule is, if the environment is not good, if the chemistry, the context for the discussion is not good, the likelihood of you getting to an agreement, to a deal, is significantly reduced. And if the environment is good, if the climate within which you're negotiating is good, the likelihood of you getting to an outcome is significantly enhanced. So getting to a deal that would serve both in your and your counterpart's needs becomes significantly better if you proactively manage the climate. So it's astounding to me that, knowing this to be true, and many experts agree on this issue here, is that so few people or organizations really invest in proactively managing the climate, in making sure that they create an environment within which people feel comfortable to share, which is friendly, which is cordial, which would, significantly increase the likelihood that people feel comfortable in entering into agreements with the counterparts, right? So let's look at the factors that will influence climate. Now, Nelson Mandela was the master of climate. He had such personal charisma. He just had the ability to set everybody at ease. And when you look at Mandela, he wasn't just this sweet man. He had a temper on him, and he had flaws. But he had such an ability to set people at ease. If you study his biography, if you listen to people who have known him and who have worked with him, they will universally attest to his ability to just personally connect with just about anybody, anywhere. He just had this magical ability to connect with people. He was really good at managing the climate or the atmosphere. But what are the things that influence the climate? Some of the things that you need to pay attention to, so that you can make sure you create an environment within which people want to agree with you, right? So the first one is politeness, or as we say, making sure that you occupy the high moral ground. Now, there's really no excuse for you to ever be impolite. I know, the best of us struggle to control our tempers at times, but you can really disagree with somebody strongly and you can still treat them with dignity, respect, and honor. There's never a reason for you to treat people with a lack of honor or respect or dignity, to get personal in the way that you respond to them. By the way, if you remember the impact or the power of the rule of reciprocity, the law of reciprocation, then you know how silly it would be for you to treat people in a way that doesn't respect their dignity, that's disrespectful, because the odds are that they're just going to return that behavior. So it's very important that you make an effort to be polite. You should go out of your way to always treat your counterparts with politeness. Never mind those closest to you, your colleagues, your family. But you should set the tone for the exchanges that you want to have. You shouldn't rely on your counterparts to do that. So it's not good enough to say that they've treated me with a lack of respect, so I'm just responding. That just makes you average. You have to decide that you want to harness reciprocity to your advantage and that you will treat people with honor, respect, and dignity at all times so that you can occupy the high moral ground. The second thing to pay attention to is the meeting place, right? Now, in today's day and world, virtual meetings are such a key part of how we do business, but it's still a meeting place. A virtual meeting is a meeting nonetheless. So you have to pay attention to the impact of first impressions, the way that you will be introducing people, greeting people, the way that you pronounce their names, the way that you engage in small talk before you commence your discussions around, doing a deal. So don't think of a meeting place only in a physical sense. In a physical sense, you have the ability to manipulate the environment, to set it up in such a way that you can create a, positive climate. And you can do the same thing virtually. And we'll be discussing that later on this week when we look at the remote negotiation best practices, how you can manage virtual meeting places and digital meeting environments. But it's very important that you understand that the atmosphere is significantly influenced by the setup of the meeting place, right? I recall instances where I've done work in crowded, hot boardrooms where, there's not enough ventilation and, in that kind of environment, people don't find themselves very agreeable at all. They just race to the end. They're not really interested in what anybody has to say because they feel uncomfortable. So it's important that you think about the best environment that would, lead to people feeling comfortable, that demonstrates to people that you have their interests at heart. Okay, then you also want to look at rapport. So how do you connect at the interpersonal level with your counterpart? And rapport is really advanced by trust and genuine interest. And what really is trust? Think about what communicates trust. Trust is the fact that you would follow through in line with the commitments that you've made. But trust is also advanced through making yourself vulnerable, right? So people are far more likely to trust you if they can see that you don't just position your strengths, but that you're also prepared to share your weaknesses, to lift the lid on some of your less than stellar characteristics. Vulnerability has a great way of opening doors for connection with your counterparts, and you'll see that the really great communicators are really good at doing that. They don't just present this picture of perfect. No, they also open the kimono, if you will. They share with you what's underneath and some of the struggles that they face and some of the challenges that they have. And they're very good at demonstrating genuine interest. So Mandela, once again, he was the master of that. People will all say when he spoke to them, they, even relatively low-level staff, cleaners, janitors, Mandela would make time for them. And when he spoke to them, he was fully invested. He wasn't just on his way to another meeting. When he paused and spoke with them or introduced himself to somebody, he would be fully invested and take a genuine interest in each and every person, not just be driven by his own agenda. You also want to pay attention to your communication style. In a cross-cultural context, this can be sometimes a cause for disagreement and for things not to work out very well, because certain cultures, certain cultural environments have a much more aggressive style of communication, and other cultures have a much more kind of subdued, submissive style of communication. This is, of course, also at a personal level interesting. Some people have an overbearing, aggressive style of communication. Also, if you're physically really big, if you're a really big guy, if you're a football player and you're 6'6" and 300 pounds, people might feel intimidated when you speak to them. So you will have to go out of your way to tone it down. When you're trying to convince people to follow your recommendations, you're going to have to take into account the fact that you have a huge overbearing presence, and that people will naturally be wary of the communication that comes from you, and be slightly defensive because it's very overbearing. So you have to pay attention to your style of communication. Also, the volume that you use. Should you be loud? Should you be quiet? Should you have inflection? Should you be both loud and more subdued? It's good to have inflection rather than be monotone all the time, because that doesn't really underpin or emphasize any parts of your communication. And do you ever use silence? Do you feel uncomfortable with silence? Do you fill silence with idle chatter, with concessions? Your communication style, and this is you actually have people who coach this stuff. All the Hollywood stars, they have elocution coaches, they have voice coaches, they have people who help them to manage the way that they communicate. Don't think that all of this just comes naturally. People who present on TV, on radio, they're professionally trained, and even if they're really good, they still take counsel. So it might not be a bad idea if you think that you have a communication style, or you've learned that your communication style is one where people maybe experience you as aggressive or as submissive. It might be considered for you to approach somebody who can work with you specifically on your communication style, on your voice, who can coach you with elocution and how to pronounce and how to pace yourself to be far more compelling in the way that you transmit your messages. And then lastly, in this context, you want to manage the space that people have available. This can be significantly influenced depending on the culture within which you find yourself. But personal space and seating is very important to people. If you're in a physical meeting, you don't want to feel like you're sitting in the middle seat of of coach on a long haul flight, because that's not comfortable. And you're not thinking about what's being discussed. You just really focus on getting out of there because you don't feel comfortable at all. You don't want to seat your counterparts facing the sun, and there's so many of these techniques that you read about that people have used in the past. And you want to make sure that you create an environment within which people feel, particularly if you're trying to sell, that they feel comfortable. So, some of the big deals that I've consulted to, we've gone to great lengths to create environments where people, can feel comfortable, where they feel able to concentrate on the subject matter, where they have access to the resources that they need to be fully productive. There's a lot of thought that you want to give to the environment. If you're doing demonstrations to potential customers, you want to optimize the environment within which you're going to be doing those demonstrations. The rule of thumb is, people like space. So you're going to give them more rather than less space. Some cultures, some environments, people are more comfortable with having people closer, and some cultures people prefer to have more distance. But generally speaking, the rule of thumb is, as you will see coming up, that we don't like to have people within our intimate zone, which is reserved for your spouse and your immediate family members. So your kids might sit in your lap, and you and your spouse might feel comfortable within each other's intimate zones. But that's really reserved for very, very few people, only those who are really the closest to you. Which is then followed by the social zone, and this is really people where the personal zone rather than the social zone. Personal zone, which is really reserved for people that you're familiar with. Maybe family, extended family. So maybe your mum, your dad, your brothers and sisters. You feel more comfortable with them in your personal zone. The social zone would be for people who fall outside of your immediate family circle, if you will. So when you meet somebody at a cocktail event, or you meet somebody at a business event, typically you'll be, if it's not an exhibition, but a smaller business event, you're meeting in a meeting room or something, or in a hotel. The social zone is typical of the distance that people feel comfortable within. And then the public zone, this is, if you encounter somebody on the street, you'll see sometimes even if somebody's asking you for directions, that they'll even like raise a hand between you and them to create some kind of physical barrier. We don't really want to let people into our personal or social zone that easily. So we can be very mindful of that. Obviously, with the COVID-19 outbreak that we all went through, the public zone became kind of the social zone. So, with the whole notion of social distancing, and that makes it difficult to connect with people. The more distance between us, obviously, the harder it is to really foster close relationships, etc. So, just be mindful of this, that you want to allow people the space that they need. You don't want to get into their personal space. Obviously, what happens is, if you forget this, if you have a preference to be really up close to people when you communicate, and we've all run into people like that who get really up into your intimate zone or your personal zone, and then you really feel like backing away or asking them to back away, and you're really not interested in what's being said. You feel so uncomfortable. This is why this is critical to consider in the context of making sure that you're negotiating within the right climate. When it comes to seating arrangements for physical meetings, this picture here. When you look at the contents and the stuff that comes out of universities and some of the writings on negotiation, they would say that this is an adversarial setting. But really, this is just a normal setting for business. When you meet somebody for the first time in a boardroom setting, it's very likely that you're going to be sitting across the table from them. I wouldn't necessarily assume that this is an adversarial setting at all. I think this is a business convention. And it's not to be avoided. I think you can embrace this kind of setting for a first meeting. Sometimes people favor this kind of setup where you're sitting side by side with somebody, particularly when people are conducting interviews. They often use this kind of setup. So, clearly it's difficult for you to hide something here. You're sending the message that you're prepared to be open, transparent in your communications. You have nothing to hide. It's a much more compromising or collaborative setup, but I would advise that you reserve this for those kind of exchanges when you're sure that things are going to be compromising or collaborative. Maybe in an interview situation, I wouldn't start off necessarily with a first meeting in a business setting with this kind of setup. The odds or the likelihood that your counterpart will feel very uncomfortable with this setup is significant. So I wouldn't go straight there. I would reserve this for maybe second, third, fourth meetings where you want to share information, you want to look at some stuff together, look at a screen together, maybe share some documentation, complete some forms together, then this kind of setup would work well. This kind of setup, you get people who are in that red quadrant, who are really people-focused. That red quadrant, if you remember back to the NBI profile that you completed, if you have a preference in that red quadrant, often I've seen people in a sales setting want to set up like this for the first meeting with a counterpart. And of course, if you have a preference in the blue quadrant, you would not walk away from this kind of setup. You'd run away. You'd run through the door if on the first meeting somebody wanted to sit next to you. So I would suggest that you be very careful with when you use this kind of setup. I'm not saying that it doesn't have any application, but this would be reserved for really well-developed relationships where you're working together on a project. Perhaps you're sharing a screen, maybe you're on a joint video call, then this kind of setting would be appropriate. Otherwise, I would be mindful, I'd be very careful before I set up in this way. Then some people would say that a round table is the best setup to use because there's no obvious position of power. And certainly when it comes to negotiating big deals, high-value transactions, one of the things that we've done many times in an advisory capacity is set up things in a hotel or a neutral venue where we actually request a big round table for setup. But then I had the opportunity once in Poland, observing a negotiation where where one of the most successful businessmen in Poland had convened a meeting, and in his boardroom, and he had a big round table. But guess what? He had one big chair, like a throne. Like his personal throne set up around the round table. So he managed to have a position of power, a clear position of power, even though the table was round. So I think it's not true that you can't manipulate a round table to demonstrate maybe what you think your strategy is, or to let your counterparts know what you think the relative positions of power are in that negotiation. However, in this kind of setting, you can also assume kind of a boy-girl seating arrangement, so one of you, one of them, one of you, one of them, if you're in a team-based negotiation, which will send a great signal that you're not here to hide anything. It'll send a very compromising, if not collaborative message using this kind of setup. So you need to give some thought to it. Will you have your team sit on the one half of the table, their team in the opposite half of the table, even though it's round, or will you set it up in a boy-girl kind of environment? So typically, if you're working jointly on a project, or if it's clear that there's collaborative intent, then this is a great setup. But don't forget that even this setup can be manipulated if you really want to. Okay, so when you look at this slide over here, I want you to think of those three components. So let's say the way that I am sending a message to you, let's say we're in the same room together and we're communicating face to face, and I am sending a message to you. My message is comprised, it's made up of those three things, my communication, right? It's the words that I'm using, the tone of voice that I'm using, and the body language that supports it. Now, in the way that I'm sending that message to you, what weighting would you assign to each one of those components in the way that it influences your understanding of what I'm communicating? So in other words, when I'm giving you a message, my words, tone of voice, and body language are the three things that are being transmitted to you. And your understanding of what I'm saying, what I'm asking you now is to say, okay, which one of these three things has the most impact or the highest impact on the way that you understand what I am communicating? So, you may have come across this model from Professor Albert Mehrabian, but it's fascinating to see that words have the least impact on the way that you understand any message that I'm transmitting to you. So this is based on face-to-face communication, right? Which is the mode of communication where you have the most cues available to help you understand what's going on, right? You can see what's happening, you can hear what's happening. The second thing is tone of voice. But by far the biggest impact on how you understand what I'm saying is associated with my body language. It's a fascinating study, this, and they've repeated this in different cultures and different settings around the world. And, there has been variances on this, but the ratio has always remained the same. Lawyers understand that contracts need to be very detailed, because when people read contracts, they don't have the context of tone of voice or body language through which to associate meaning to the words in the contract. So wherever you go in the world, when you read a contract, what does a contract always start with? The first page or the first few pages of any contract always contains definitions. When we say 24 hours, we mean the time period between 0000 and 23:59:59. That's how we define a day. When we talk about a date, we mean the Gregorian calendar. When we talk about a company, we mean this company based at this location, right? So when the tone of voice, when the body language is missing, we have to become very detailed in our communication to make sure that we can accurately communicate our intent. So it's interesting, the impact of this on the way that we communicate is quite profound, because there's so much focus in our society and the way that the schooling and education system is set up on the words, on the evidence that we use, rather than the context that surrounds it, right? Rather than the tone of voice or the body language that accompanies those words, that accompany the message that we're transmitting. And so when you're looking at different means of communication, this clearly helps you to understand which the most effective means of communications will be. So in the digital world, we've now moved to video conferencing being, something that's in everyday use, but it doesn't quite give you the same level of connection as a face-to-face in-person meeting. It's a lot better than just a phone call in terms of conveying accurate understanding and being able to communicate accurately, because at least we can discern some body language cues visually, but we can still easily miss a lot of them. It's quite imperfect. What you're really looking for is you're looking for congruency between what's being said and how it's being said. We'll say more about that in a minute. But the key thing to understand here, therefore, is that if you try to negotiate or close deals using written communications, so words only, the odds that you're going to be misunderstood are significantly enhanced, right? So think for yourself. I'm quite sure you've had occasions where you've sent emails, and often within companies, people have a preference, or they like to send these short little one-liner emails. When you send these kind of emails, it's very easy for your counterparts to misunderstand what you're doing, what you're saying, what you're trying to bring across. I'm sure you've had this experience where somebody sent an email and then you have to write War and Peace, 3 chapters worth of explanation that wasn't what you actually meant. What you actually meant was this. This is the risk of negotiating via email, because it's devoid of context. It doesn't have all the context that you need to be able to accurately communicate what it is that you're trying to bring across. By the way, also, if I'm going to lie to you, if somebody's going to lie to you, what's the easiest way for somebody to lie to you? Is it for them to confront you in person, face to face, and to share their lie? Or would it be for them to phone you up to share the lie? Or maybe for them to send you a text or an email? And then the lawyers will say, well, but hang on, if I send you a lie via email or text, then that's risky because you'll have a record of my lie. Of course, that would be true, but people don't just lie about things that you can challenge them in court about, right? People will lie about their budgets, or they'll lie about their true intent, and any number of things which you won't be able to pick up on if you're not in a position to actually see their body language, understand their tone of voice. So when it comes to the body language area specifically, it's very important to realize that, particularly when you're negotiating in a way where you're on video or face-to-face, you have to proactively be aware of your body language as well as interpreting and understanding your counterpart's body language. And the key thing is to look for congruency, right? So is what's being said consistent with how it's being said? Does your counterpart maintain eye contact? Specifically when you start talking about price, right? When you're putting out anchors, this is where, from my perspective, if I'm in a sales negotiation and I'm now going to mention price, I will make sure that I have eye contact when I mention price the first time. I want to look my counterpart right in the eye, and I want to see how they respond to me communicating the price. But secondly, I want to send a confident message to them when I communicate the price by making full eye contact before I mention the price. Right, so it's been said you can't sell Coke if you've got Pepsi in the fridge. If you don't believe in what you're saying, then why would your counterparts believe it? Confidence is a key thing that underpins successful negotiation. So in terms of how you understand body language, also understand that it's body language, not body word. So you really want to look for body language sentences, almost, if you will. So you want to look for at least 3 cues before you make any conclusions. If I'm sitting across the table from you while you're talking, maybe I'm leaning back, I'm kind of looking away. That might just mean that I'm thinking, right? Or maybe I've got my arms crossed. It might just mean that I'm comfortable. It doesn't mean that I'm closing you off. But if I'm tapping my foot, my arms are crossed, and I'm leaning back, looking up into the air, probably you can safely assume that I'm not engaged, I'm not interested. So what we look for is a series of things. We look, or a combination of things happening at the same time. At least 3 inputs, 3 cues you're looking for before you make any conclusions, right? So just because somebody's crossing their legs, it might just mean that it's a comfortable way for them to sit. Doesn't mean that they're shutting you out or that they're being defensive in their positioning. So I like to, when you specifically also in a group-based environment, when you're negotiating, I also like to look at the people who are not talking and to observe their body language, how they respond to what's being said, how do they interact with their counterparts, how do they respond to what their colleagues are saying, not just to what they do in response to what you're saying, because you can easily pick up if there's misalignment or opportunities for them to even disagree internally in their team, so that you can make sure that you can proactively address those things and manage everybody's interests. So my wife, Linda, she's really, really good at understanding the body language thing. And I've gotten so much better over the years, because you really want to look at what's not being verbalized. People will often say things that they don't mean. And you can very easily pick that up by looking at the body language. So particularly when you're selling, you can learn far more by looking at how people respond to what you're saying than to listen to the actual words that they're using. And this opportunity is often missed because we sit there and we take notes, writing down everything that our counterpart's saying, when as a matter of fact, you would learn a whole lot more by just being fully invested in the conversation and not making any notes. Maybe at the end of the meeting, you can jot down one or two things so that you have a reference and you can remember what was said in the meeting. But I would caution against copiously writing down what your counterpart's saying. You will learn far more about what they really mean, about what's really important to them, if you can just engage in a conversational manner, keep eye contact, and be fully invested in the conversation. When it comes to confidence, it's really key that you communicate in a way that transmits confidence. People are not, in the habit of following recommendations, advice, instructions from people who lack confidence, right? So there's a distinction, there's a difference between confidence and arrogance. People love confident people. People don't like arrogant people. So don't be afraid to step up and be confident. One of probably the key challenges that people have with sales negotiation is a lack of confidence. Over the years, I've always surveyed every group that I've worked with, and guaranteed at least a third to half of the people in every group that I've worked with around the world have shared with me that confidence is a challenge for them. So this is by far the largest challenge that people have in the context of sales and negotiation. They lack the confidence because they don't necessarily have a benchmark. They don't know how good they are. They maybe have had experiences in life that hasn't exactly set them up to be confident in the way they come across things. So I always urge them to look at 4 different areas to bolster, to boost their confidence. And so if confidence is an issue for you, I would urge you to examine these 4 areas. Some of them fall outside of the scope of what we can cover in this program, but it's important to know that, a key part of your confidence is really found in your view of your identity. The best evidence I can offer for this, and I'm not trying to make a religious statement here, when you look at politicians, you can see that they have a strong sense of identity. They're the masters of being able to respond to challenges or questions in a way that's very confident and sometimes completely, founded on absolute, rubbish. They have no idea what they're talking about, but they can talk so very confidently. They can talk about that nonsense completely, with complete confidence, and that's because they have a strong belief in their ability to recover, to deal with fallout. They understand that things don't always go well, and that you have to do some damage repair from time to time, and you have to present an outward image that says, to those who follow you, look, I got this. Even if I don't know the answer, I know where to go find the answer. So you really need to think of how it is that you see yourself, because that's what you're going to be portraying out there. What goes in your mind is what you'll see reflected in your life. So what is it that you think about yourself? What are the past experiences you've had that have given you the information that you've processed to arrive at your perspective of your current identity? So if you lack confidence, that's one angle that you want to think about and see if you can address. The second one is how much practice are you getting, right? It's no surprise that you will lack confidence in something if you've just not spent much time doing it. Use golf as an example. You have no reason to be confident going on the golf course if you never ever practice playing golf. And the fact that you used to play good golf 12 years ago doesn't mean that you're going to play good golf today if you haven't practiced much in between. If you haven't spent time playing golf, guess what? You're going to lack the confidence. It's not going to be reasonable for you to expect to do well. Same thing is true in sales and negotiation. And it's crazy for me. Most salespeople are just not prepared to engage in simulations, exercises, to create standardized scripts for standardized components of the sales process. They're just not prepared to practice, yet they're expecting stellar results. This would be like a professional tennis player expecting to win Wimbledon or the US Open, but to never practice. Those guys understand the basics. I mean, they're the masters of the basics, and they still do the basics. Repetition is the mother of skill, right? You can attend 50 sales training courses, 50 negotiation training courses, and you will still not know everything that there is to know about sales negotiations and closing deals, right? You can be the top performing salesperson in any organization, and you can still get better if you're prepared to practice, if you're prepared to refine your approach. So the number one thing that's really easy for you to influence in terms of your confidence is to make sure that you get some practice in, that you simulate, that you exercise. That's going to do wonders for your confidence. Much better to fail in a safe environment than to fail in real life. Why would you want to trial things for the first time in real life scenarios when you have the opportunity to practice it in simulations with your colleagues, with your co-workers, with friends, whoever may be available? The other input invariably into your level of confidence is how much experience have you had, right? If you've been doing something for a long time, typically you'll have more confidence, an enhanced level of confidence in that domain, in that environment. So it's not unnatural for you to feel a lack of confidence when you start doing something anew, afresh, the first time. Embrace it. Don't avoid it, because that's where the growth takes place. The growth always takes place in the place where you feel uncomfortable, right? So takes us to the last one, which is what is your personal style? Now, Linda has she's built a whole business on personal style, and I've seen incredibly transformative testimonials about people's lives who have been deeply impacted because they've changed the way that they present themselves physically, because they've not even talking about losing weight, but they've just chosen personal style as a way to portray and a perspective, an image of themselves consistent with what they like to put out there, right? So if you want to be influential, you have to look the part. You have to dress and project a sense of style that is consistent with the message that you want to put out there. So what is your personal style? Most people don't even have a vision for their personal style. They don't have a personal brand or a way to project themselves. So there's a lot of confidence to be found if you can figure out what your personal style is. And you will see Linda in action in a module on personal style later this week, where she will specifically speak to some of the practical things that you can do to really up the stakes in terms of personal style. Because what we want you to be at the end of this at the end of this program is one seriously confident and dangerous sales negotiator.